The heart monitor beeped steadily in room 314 of St. Mary's Hospital on December 15, 1973, at exactly 4:18 a.m. Mom had been fighting ovarian cancer for 16 brutal months that had transformed our vibrant family into a shadow of what we once were. The morphine, a powerful painkiller derived from the opium poppy plant that doctors give to dying patients to control severe pain, had been making her say confusing and strange things for weeks. She would try to say, "Pass the water," but it came out as, "Class the daughter." She would attempt to ask for her pillow, but the words would emerge as, "Follow the billow." We thought it was just normal confusion from the medicine affecting her brain. At that exact moment, when everything changed forever, Mom's eyes opened wide and looked straight at Dad with an intensity that cut through her drug-induced haze. Her voice became clear and strong for the first time in days, cutting through the mechanical sounds of the hospital equipment. She spoke 7 words with perfect clarity. "Attack our daughter and you'll like it." Then she closed her eyes, took 3 more shallow breaths, and died 2 minutes later, while Dad and I stared at each other in absolute shock. Those 7 words completely destroyed my world and everything I thought I knew about my family. I was 19 years old, home from college for Christmas break, and I had always trusted Dad completely. He had been my hero, my protector, the man who had worked 16-hour days to pay for my education and never missed a single one of my school events. But now, I was absolutely terrified because I thought Mom was using her dying breath to warn me that Dad might sexually assault me. I had no idea that morphine disrupts the brain's speech centers so severely that dying people often say words they don't mean at all. Rape and raise can sound identical when someone is dying and their brain isn't working properly due to medication. For 3 terrifying months, I was scared of the man who had loved me my whole life. I almost called the police to report him for a crime he never committed before I discovered the truth that saved our family. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Martinez, and I grew up in Riverside, California, a mid-sized city about 60 miles east of Los Angeles, where the desert meets suburban sprawl. My parents owned and operated a small Mexican restaurant called Casa Martinez that had been serving authentic Oaxacan food to the local community for 15 years. The restaurant was located on a busy street corner in the heart of Riverside's Mexican-American neighborhood, surrounded by other family-owned businesses, small grocery stores, and the kind of tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's stories. Dad Roberto Martinez was 48 years old and worked as both the head cook and general manager of our restaurant. He was a quiet, thoughtful man who stood about 5'8", with graying black hair and gentle brown eyes that reflected his calm personality. Dad spoke softly in both English and Spanish, never raised his voice even when the restaurant got busy during dinner rush, and had earned a reputation throughout our community as someone you could trust completely. He had emigrated from Oaxaca, Mexico when he was 23 years old, with nothing but a suitcase and a determination to build a better life for his future family. Mom Carmen. Elena Martinez was 46 years old and handled the front-of-house operations at our restaurant, including greeting customers, managing the books, ordering supplies, and serving as the warm, welcoming face that made people want to return week after week. She was a petite woman with long black hair that she wore in a neat braid, bright eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and an infectious smile that could make even the grumpiest customer feel welcome. Mom had been born in Riverside to Mexican immigrant parents and spoke perfect English and Spanish, serving as a bridge between the older Mexican customers who preferred Spanish and the younger American-born customers who spoke primarily English. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house directly behind the restaurant, connected by a short walkway that allowed my parents to easily move between work and home throughout each day. The house was painted bright yellow with blue trim, had a small front yard where Mom grew roses and vegetables, and felt like the safest, most loving place in the world. Our living room was filled with comfortable, well-worn furniture, family photographs documenting every milestone of my childhood, and the constant smell of the delicious food that drifted over from the restaurant kitchen. I was a sophomore at UC Riverside, majoring in social work with dreams of helping families in crisis navigate the complex systems designed to protect children and reunite broken families. I had always been a good student, maintaining a 3.7 GPA while working part-time at the campus library to help with expenses that my parents' modest restaurant income couldn't quite cover. My goal was to become a licensed clinical social worker, specializing in family therapy, inspired by my own experience growing up in a loving, stable home and wanting to help other families achieve the same happiness. My best friend since childhood was Lisa Chen, who lived in the house next door to ours, with her parents who had immigrated from Taiwan when Lisa was 5 years old. Lisa was also a sophomore at UC Riverside, studying nursing with plans to specialize in oncology nursing cancer care after watching several family members battle various forms of the disease. Lisa had been like a sister to me throughout our childhood, and she had become invaluable during Mom's illness because her nursing studies helped her understand the medical terminology and procedures that often confused Dad and me. Our family wasn't wealthy by any means. Restaurant owners work long hours for modest profits. But we were genuinely happy and deeply connected to each other and our community. We ate dinner together every single night at 8 p.m. after the restaurant closed, discussing our days, sharing neighborhood gossip, and planning weekend activities. We attended St. Teresa Catholic Church every Sunday, where Dad served as an usher and Mom sang in the Spanish-language choir. We took annual summer vacations to visit Dad's family in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I learned to speak Spanish fluently and developed a deep appreciation for my cultural heritage. Everything in our peaceful, predictable world began falling apart in August 1972 when Mom started experiencing persistent abdominal pain and bloating that she initially dismissed as stress from managing the restaurant during busy summer months. When the symptoms persisted and worsened over several weeks, she finally made an appointment with our family doctor, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who had been caring for our family since I was a small child. Dr. Rodriguez immediately ordered blood tests and imaging studies that revealed something terrifying. Mom had advanced ovarian cancer that had already spread to her lymph nodes, liver, and other organs throughout her abdominal cavity. The diagnosis hit our family like a physical blow, turning our secure world upside down in a matter of hours. The oncologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, was a compassionate woman in her 50s who specialized in gynecological cancers at Riverside Community Hospital. During our first meeting, she explained ovarian cancer in terms we could understand. Ovarian cancer is often called the silent killer because it rarely causes obvious symptoms until it has already spread extensively throughout the body. By the time most patients experience noticeable symptoms, like Carmen has been having, the cancer has typically reached an advanced stage that makes cure very difficult. Dr. Williams outlined the treatment plan: immediate surgery to remove as much of the cancer as possible, followed by 6 months of intensive chemotherapy treatments designed to kill any remaining cancer cells. Chemotherapy uses powerful drugs that attack fast-growing cells throughout the body, she explained. Unfortunately, these drugs can't distinguish between cancer cells and healthy fast-growing cells like hair follicles, which is why patients experience hair loss, nausea, fatigue, and other difficult side effects. Mom underwent the surgery in September 1972, spending 8 days in the hospital recovering from the extensive operation that removed her ovaries, fallopian tubes, and several affected lymph nodes. The chemotherapy treatments began in October and continued through March 1973, administered every 3 weeks through an IV line at the hospital's oncology clinic. The side effects were brutal constant nausea that made eating nearly impossible, fatigue so severe that Mom could barely get out of bed some days, complete hair loss that left her bald and self-conscious about her appearance, and a compromised immune system that made her vulnerable to infections. Throughout this entire ordeal, Dad was absolutely amazing. He took over all the cooking at the restaurant while also managing the business side, hired additional staff to help when Mom couldn't work, and spent every free moment caring for her with patience and devotion that never wavered. He would sit beside her bed reading Spanish poetry while she slept, help her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk alone, and hold her head when the chemotherapy made her vomit for hours at a time. The treatments seemed to work initially, By April 1973, follow-up scans showed that the cancer had shrunk significantly, and Dr. Williams cautiously expressed optimism about Mom's prognosis. We celebrated by taking a short vacation to the beach, where Mom wore a colorful headscarf to cover her bald head, and we took dozens of photographs of what we hoped would be the beginning of her recovery. But in November 1973, routine blood tests revealed that Mom's cancer markers were rising rapidly, indicating that the disease had returned with a vengeance. Additional scans confirmed our worst fears: the cancer had spread throughout her abdominal cavity and had begun affecting her liver, lungs, and bones. Dr. Williams delivered the devastating news that Mom's cancer was now terminal and that further aggressive treatment would only cause suffering without providing any meaningful extension of life. At this point, our focus needs to shift from trying to cure the cancer to keeping Carmen as comfortable as possible during the time she has left, Dr. Williams explained during a family meeting in her office. Based on the extent of the disease, we're looking at weeks to months rather than years. I'm going to refer you to our palliative care team, who specialize in managing pain and other symptoms for terminally ill patients. That's when the morphine treatments began, forever changing the trajectory of our family's story in ways we couldn't have imagined. The palliative care team was led by Dr. James Patterson, a gentleman in his 60s, who had been helping terminally ill patients and their families for over 20 years. During our first meeting, Dr. Patterson explained that morphine would be the primary medication for managing Mom's pain during her final weeks of life. Morphine is derived from the opium poppy plant and has been used for pain relief for thousands of years. Dr. Patterson explained, showing us diagrams of how the medication works in the human body. It binds to specific receptors in the brain and spinal cord that control pain perception, effectively blocking pain signals before they can reach the conscious mind. For patients with advanced cancer who are experiencing severe bone pain and organ pain, morphine is often the only medication strong enough to provide adequate relief. However, Dr. Patterson also warned us about morphine's side effects on cognitive function and speech patterns. Morphine affects multiple areas of the brain simultaneously. He continued, pointing to a detailed brain diagram on his office wall. While it blocks pain very effectively, it also interferes with the brain regions that control memory, logical thinking, and most importantly, for your family's speech production. Patients on morphine often experience what we call word salad. They know what they want to say, but completely different words come out of their mouth. He gave us specific examples that seemed almost comical at the time. A patient might try to say, "I love you," but it comes out as, "I glove you," or "I shove you." Someone wanting to say, "close the door," might say, "chose the floor," instead. This happens because morphine disrupts the neural pathways that connect thoughts to speech, causing the brain to send garbled signals to the mouth and tongue. Dr. Patterson emphasized that these speech distortions become more severe as morphine dosages increase to manage worsening pain. In the final days or hours of life, when we often need to use very high doses of morphine, patients may say things that sound completely unlike anything they would normally say. Families should understand that these confused words don't reflect the patient's true thoughts or feelings. They're simply the result of medication interfering with brain function. At the time, I thought this was just technical medical information that might help us understand what to expect during Mom's final days. I had absolutely no idea how tragically important Dr. Patterson's warnings would become for our family's future. The morphine treatments began immediately, administered through a small pump that delivered continuous doses throughout the day and night. Initially, the medication worked wonderfully. Mom's pain decreased significantly, and she was able to eat small meals and have conversations with family members who came to visit. But within a week, we started noticing the speech problems Dr. Patterson had described. Mom would try to ask for water and say "daughter" instead. She would attempt to say, "I'm tired," but it would come out as, "I'm wired." These incidents seemed almost amusing at first, and we would gently correct her while she laughed at her own confused words. But as her condition worsened and the morphine dosage increased, the speech distortions became more frequent and more dramatic. By early December, Mom was having difficulty communicating clearly for hours at a time. She would try to say, "I love you," and the words would emerge as, "I shove you," or "I glove shoe." She would attempt to ask Dad to adjust her pillows and say, "Billow the mallows," instead. These episodes frustrated her because she knew exactly what she wanted to say, but the words that came out of her mouth bore no resemblance to her thoughts. The night Mom died, December 15th, 1973, started exactly like the previous several nights had. Dad and I were both staying at the hospital because Dr. Williams had warned us that the end was very near, probably within hours rather than days. Mom had been unconscious for most of the day, breathing slowly and irregularly in a pattern that the nurses said indicated her body was beginning the final process of shutting down. Around 2 a.m., she started making more frequent attempts to speak, even though her eyes remained closed and she appeared to be unconscious. Her words came out as complete nonsense. "Farble the water," when she was trying to ask for ice chips to wet her dry mouth. "Meep the pillow," when she was uncomfortable and wanted her position changed. "Billow the candle," when she was trying to say something about the blankets being too warm. The night nurse on duty was Mrs. Carmen Rodriguez, an experienced oncology nurse who had worked with terminal patients for over 15 years. She took time to reassure Dad and me that Mom's confused speech was completely normal and expected at this stage of morphine treatment. "The medication is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, keeping her comfortable and pain-free," Mrs. Rodriguez explained as she checked Mom's IV line and adjusted her position in the hospital bed. Her brain knows what she wants to communicate, but the morphine is scrambling the signals between her thoughts and her speech. It's like her brain is trying to speak English, but her mouth is speaking a foreign language. This doesn't mean she's in distress or that anything is wrong, it's just how morphine affects the speech centers in the brain. Mrs. Rodriguez also mentioned that patients sometimes have brief moments of clarity right before death, when they seem to gather their final strength for one last communication with their loved ones. Sometimes the confusion lifts for a few seconds or minutes, and patients can speak clearly again, she said. But even during these clear moments, the morphine can still cause words to come out differently than intended. At 4:15 a.m., Mom's breathing became noticeably more labored and irregular, with longer pauses between breaths that indicated she was very close to death. Dad sat on the right side of her hospital bed, holding her left hand, while I sat on the left side, holding her right hand. We had been maintaining this vigil for hours, talking to her softly and telling her how much we loved her, even though we weren't sure if she could hear or understand us anymore. Her eyes had been closed for hours, but at exactly 4:18 a.m., they suddenly opened wide and focused on Dad's face with startling clarity and intensity. The change was so dramatic and unexpected that both Dad and I were startled by the sudden alertness in her gaze. She took the deepest breath she had managed in days, gathering strength from some hidden reserve that we didn't know still existed. Then, with a voice that was stronger and clearer than it had been in weeks, she spoke 7 words that would haunt our family for months. "Attack our daughter, and you'll like it." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. They were spoken with such strength, clarity, and apparent conviction that there was absolutely no possibility of misunderstanding what she had said. Her voice carried none of the slurred, confused quality that had characterized her speech for weeks. These words were deliberate, intentional, and terrifyingly clear. Dad's face went completely white, as if all the blood had suddenly drained from his body. His mouth fell open in shock, and his hands began trembling as he continued to hold Mom's hand. I jerked my hand away from Mom's grip and stumbled backward, knocking over my chair and staring at Dad in absolute horror and disbelief. Before either of us could respond, ask questions, or try to understand what she meant, Mom's eyes closed again. Her breathing became even more shallow and irregular, and exactly 2 minutes later, she took her final breath. The heart monitor showed a flat line, and an alarm began beeping to alert the nursing staff that a patient had died. The next hour after Mom's death was a whirlwind of medical procedures, paperwork, and immediate decisions that had to be made while we were still in shock from her final words. Nurses came to disconnect the medical equipment and prepare Mom's body for transport to the funeral home. Dr. Williams arrived to officially pronounce the time of death and discuss our options regarding an autopsy, which we declined. Phone calls had to be made to notify relatives and family friends the funeral home needed to be contacted to make arrangements, and dozens of forms required signatures for everything from death certificates to personal belongings. But throughout all of this necessary activity, those 7 words kept echoing in my mind with increasing intensity and confusion. Why had Mom's speech suddenly become perfectly clear just to say something so horrible about Dad? Why would she use her final breath to make such a shocking accusation? Had she discovered something terrible about Dad's character that she felt compelled to reveal before leaving this world? The funeral was held 4 days later at St. Teresa Catholic Church, the same church where our family had worshiped together every Sunday for as long as I could remember. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity with customers from our restaurant who had become like extended family over the years. Dad's friends from the local Mexican-American business community, Mom's coworkers from various community organizations, and my college classmates who had driven down from UC Riverside to support me during this difficult time. Father Lopez, who had been our parish priest for over a decade, delivered a beautiful homily about Mom's devotion to family, her generous spirit in helping other immigrant families navigate American society, and her unwavering Catholic faith, even during the darkest days of her illness. He spoke about her volunteer work, organizing Christmas toy drives for underprivileged children, her years of service singing in the church choir, and her ability to make everyone feel welcomed and valued. Mrs. Chen, Lisa's mother, gave a tearful eulogy about how Mom had helped their family when they first immigrated from Taiwan, providing free meals at the restaurant when money was tight and helping Mrs. Chen practice English for her citizenship test. Mr. Gonzalez from the auto shop down the street told everyone how Mom had given his children free lunches every day for 2 months when he was unemployed, never asking for repayment, and never making his family feel like charity cases. But I barely heard any of these beautiful tributes to Mom's life and character. Throughout the entire funeral service, those 7 words kept repeating in my head like a broken record, drowning out everything else that was being said. I found myself staring at Dad during the entire ceremony, studying his face for signs of guilt, shame, or hidden knowledge that might explain why Mom felt compelled to issue such a terrible warning about him with her dying breath. Dad looked absolutely devastated and heartbroken, which seemed completely normal and expected for a man who had just lost his beloved wife after 24 years of marriage. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, his hands shook when he tried to turn pages in his hymnal, and his voice broke when he attempted to join in singing hymns that he and Mom had sung together for decades. But I started wondering if there was something else beneath his grief, some secret guilt or terrible knowledge that would explain Mom's shocking final words. After the burial service at Riverside Memorial Cemetery, where Mom was laid to rest under a beautiful oak tree near a small chapel, people gathered at our house behind the restaurant for the traditional meal that follows Mexican funerals. Our small living room and kitchen filled with casseroles, homemade tamales, fresh tortillas, and desserts that neighbors had prepared, according to customs that connected us to generations of grieving families. Lisa stayed close to me throughout the entire day, sensing that something beyond normal grief was troubling me deeply. She had known me long enough to recognize when I was keeping important secrets, and she could see that I was struggling with emotions and fears that went far beyond the natural sadness of losing a parent. "Sarah, you seem more than just sad," Lisa whispered to me as we stood in the kitchen washing dishes after most of the guests had gone home. "You look scared, like genuinely frightened. What's really going on that you're not telling me?" "I'm just tired and overwhelmed." I lied, avoiding her searching gaze and focusing intently on scrubbing a casserole dish that was already clean. It's been a really long, emotional day, but Lisa knew me far too well to be fooled by such obvious deflection. "This isn't about being tired, Sarah," she said, drying dishes with more force than necessary. Something specific happened that's making you afraid? What occurred at the hospital when your mom died that you haven't told anyone about? I wanted desperately to confide in Lisa about Mom's final words, but I couldn't bring myself to say them out loud. How could I tell my best friend that my dying mother had apparently tried to warn me that my father was some kind of sexual predator? How could I admit that I was starting to be genuinely afraid of the man who had raised me with nothing but love, patience, and devotion? That evening, after all the guests had finally gone home and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Dad and I found ourselves alone together in our living room for the first time since Mom had died. The silence felt heavy and oppressive, filled with unspoken tension and confusion that neither of us knew how to address properly. Dad sat in his usual armchair, still wearing his black funeral suit, looking completely exhausted and emotionally drained from the day's events. I perched on the edge of the sofa, positioning myself as far away from him as possible, while still technically being in the same room. When he tried to begin a gentle conversation about Mom's final words, I found that I absolutely couldn't handle hearing what he might say. Mija. Dad began using the Spanish term of endearment that he had called me since childhood, about what your mama said at the very end in the hospital. I know those words must have sounded very strange and frightening to you, but you have to understand that the morphine was making her confused, and I don't want to talk about it, I interrupted abruptly, standing up so quickly that I knocked over my cup of coffee and sent it spilling across the coffee table. But we need to discuss this, sweetheart, Dad continued gently, his voice filled with patience and concern. Those words weren't what she meant to say. The medicine was affecting her brain, making her say things she didn't mean. Dr. Patterson warned us that this might happen. Your mama would never— I said I don't want to talk about it. I snapped, surprising both of us with how harsh and cold my voice sounded. Why can't you just leave me alone about this? Without waiting for his response or giving him a chance to explain further, I ran upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me, something I had never done in my entire 19 years of life. For my entire childhood and adolescence, I had never felt the need to lock my bedroom door because I had always felt completely safe and protected in my own home. Dad had always respected my privacy, never entering my room without permission, and certainly never giving me any reason to fear him or question his motives. But now, for the first time in my life, I was genuinely afraid to be alone with my father. The man who had taught me to drive a car, helped me with algebra homework, worked 16 hours a day to pay for my college education, and never so much as raised his voice at me, suddenly felt like a complete stranger who might be hiding terrible secrets about his true nature and intentions toward me. Over the next several weeks, I began systematically avoiding Dad as much as humanly possible, developing elaborate strategies and schedules to minimize the time we spent alone together in our house or at the restaurant. I started leaving the house at 6 a.m. every morning, catching early buses to campus, instead of letting Dad drive me as he had done every day since I started college. After my classes ended each afternoon, I would go directly to Lisa's house to study, or I would stay late at the university library, working on assignments that could easily have been completed at home. When I absolutely had to come home each evening, I would time my arrival for after Dad had gone to bed, using my key to slip quietly through the back door and creep upstairs to my room without having to interact with him or engage in the kind of casual conversation that had been natural between us my entire life. On weekends, I made elaborate plans to spend entire days away from home, volunteering at church, studying with classmates, or taking long walks through Riverside's residential neighborhoods, just to avoid being alone with Dad. When we were forced to be in the same room together, during unavoidable encounters in the kitchen, or brief moments when I had to help with restaurant paperwork, I kept our conversations as short as possible and maintained as much physical distance between us as the space would allow. If Dad tried to hug me goodnight, which had been a cherished nightly ritual throughout my childhood, I would pull away awkwardly and mumble excuses about being tired or having homework to finish. If he offered to help with college assignments or asked about my classes and professors, I would give one-word answers and find reasons to leave the room as quickly as possible. Dad noticed the dramatic change in my behavior immediately, and his confusion hurt, and emotional pain were obvious in everything he did and said. The man who had always been confident and sure of himself in his role as my father now seemed hesitant and uncertain, as if he was walking on eggshells around his own daughter and didn't understand what he had done wrong to deserve such cold treatment. He tried multiple times over the first month after Mom's death to initiate gentle conversations about her final words, approaching the subject carefully and with obvious concern for my emotional state. But each time he brought up the topic, I would immediately shut down the discussion and flee to my room before he could offer any explanation or help me understand what had really happened in the hospital. "Sarah, please sit down so we can talk about this properly," Dad said one evening as I hurried through the kitchen, trying to avoid yet another awkward dinner together. He was standing at the stove, heating up leftover soup from the restaurant, looking tired and defeated after another long day of managing both the business and his grief. "I can see that you're confused and frightened by what your mama said before she died. But I can explain what really happened, if you'll just give me a chance to help you understand the medical reasons behind her confused words." "Why can't you just leave me alone about this?" I replied coldly, not even pausing to look at him as I grabbed my backpack and headed toward the door. The hurt that flashed across Dad's face was unmistakable and heartbreaking, but I pushed down any sympathy I might have felt. If Mom had tried to warn me about him with her dying words, then maybe he deserved to feel hurt and rejected. Maybe his pain was evidence of his guilt rather than proof of his innocence. Lisa became my emotional lifeline during this increasingly dark and paranoid period of my life. She was the only person who knew that something serious was troubling me beyond the normal grief that follows a parent's death, and she could see that I was struggling with fears and suspicions that I wasn't willing to share with anyone else. Lisa kept pressing me for details about what was really wrong, sensing that I was keeping crucial information from her that might explain my increasingly erratic behavior. "Sarah, you're acting like you're genuinely scared of your own father," Lisa said one afternoon as we sat in her family's small kitchen working on our psychology homework together. "I've known your dad since we were 7 years old, and he's literally the gentlest, most patient man I've ever met in my entire life. What happened at the hospital the night your mom died that you're not telling me about?" Finally, after weeks of keeping this terrible secret bottled up inside and feeling like I was slowly going insane from the isolation and fear, I broke down completely and told Lisa about Mom's final words. Lisa listened, without interrupting, her dark eyes growing progressively wider with shock and concern as I repeated those 7 devastating words that had been haunting my days and nights. "Sarah, that doesn't sound anything like your mom," Lisa said very carefully when I finished my account. "Your mom loved your dad more than anything in the world except you. She was always talking about what a wonderful husband and father he was, how lucky she felt to have found such a good man. And you told me yourself that the morphine was making her say weird, confused things for weeks before she died. Right? Remember what Dr. Patterson said about morphine affecting speech patterns and causing patients to say words they don't mean? Like, what could she have meant instead?" I asked desperately, wanting more than anything to believe there was some innocent explanation, but unable to imagine what it could possibly be. Those words were crystal clear, Lisa. She wasn't confused or slurred when she said them. It was the clearest she had spoken in days. "I don't know what she meant to say," Lisa admitted honestly, "but your dad has never given you any reason to be afraid of him in your entire 19 years of life. Think about all the years you've known him, Sarah. Remember when my dad was dying of lung cancer and your dad came over to our house every single day for 3 months to help with yard work and house repairs that my mom couldn't handle alone? Remember how gentle and patient he was with my mom when she was crying about losing her husband? Does that sound like someone who would hurt you?" Lisa's words made perfect logical sense, but fear isn't rational or logical. It feeds on doubt and uncertainty, growing stronger in darkness and isolation, like some kind of emotional cancer. Every day that Dad failed to provide a satisfactory explanation for Mom's final words felt like confirmation that there was something terrible he was trying to hide from me. I started watching him carefully whenever we were forced to be in the same room together, looking for signs of guilt or inappropriate behavior that I might have missed during my childhood innocence. When Dad did completely normal fatherly things, asking about my grades at college, reminding me about family obligations like visiting relatives, offering to help with tuition payments, or scholarship applications, I began interpreting these innocent interactions as evidence of something more sinister and controlling. Why was he so interested in my college schedule and my whereabouts throughout the day? Was he trying to monitor my movements and control my activities? Why did he want to know whether I was dating anyone or had developed close relationships with male classmates? The situation deteriorated even further one evening when I accidentally discovered Dad crying alone in Mom's bedroom. I had come home from studying at Lisa's house and heard strange, muffled sounds coming from behind the closed door of my parents' room. Sounds that my increasingly paranoid mind initially interpreted as something potentially threatening or suspicious. But when I crept closer to investigate, pressing my ear against the door, I realized that he was sobbing with the kind of deep, heartbroken grief that comes from losing the person you love most in the world. Through the thin bedroom door, I could hear him talking to himself, or perhaps to a photograph of Mom that sat on their dresser. "Carmen, I miss you so much I can barely breathe," he whispered through his tears. "I don't understand why Sarah is pulling away from me when we should be supporting each other through this terrible time. I feel like I'm losing both of you, and I don't know what to do to fix this." Instead of feeling sympathy and compassion for his obvious grief and confusion, I felt a surge of suspicious paranoia that made my heart race with fear. Why was he so upset about my emotional distance from him? Was it normal paternal concern for his grieving daughter? Or was there something more selfish and inappropriate motivating his distress? Had Mom confronted him about his feelings toward me before she died, leading to those horrible final words? 3 weeks after Mom's funeral, my fear and paranoia reached a dangerous new level that should have been a clear warning sign that my thinking had become seriously distorted by trauma grief and isolation. I made a decision that I'm still deeply ashamed to remember. I started keeping a sharp kitchen knife hidden under my mattress, telling myself it was just for protection in case my worst fears about Dad turned out to be true. Every night before going to bed, I would check to make sure the knife was still there, easily accessible if I needed to defend myself. I practiced grabbing it quickly in the dark, imagining scenarios where I might need to use it to protect myself from the man who had tucked me into bed and read me bedtime stories throughout my childhood. The fact that I felt I needed a weapon to protect myself from my own father should have shown me that my judgment had become dangerously compromised by fear and grief, but at the time, it seemed like a reasonable precaution. I also began researching sexual abuse and family violence at the university library, spending hours reading psychology textbooks and case studies about men who had led double lives for years while secretly abusing their children. The more I read, the more convinced I became that such deceptions were not only possible, but disturbingly common throughout American society. Academic studies described fathers and stepfathers who had maintained facades of respectability and kindness for decades while committing terrible crimes against their own families and community leaders, whose dark secrets had eventually been exposed in shocking revelations that destroyed families and communities. How many other young women had missed the warning signs because they loved and trusted their fathers completely? How many mothers had taken terrible knowledge to their graves, unable or unwilling to speak the truth while they were alive, but finding the courage to issue a warning with their final breath? The research filled me with paranoid certainty that I was probably not the first person to be fooled by a predator's carefully constructed public persona. 6 weeks after Mom's death on a cold February morning when rain was falling steadily on Riverside's empty streets, Lisa made a suggestion that would ultimately save our family from complete destruction. "Sarah, I think we should call Dr. Patterson," Lisa announced as we sat in the university cafeteria eating lunch together. "You know, the palliative care doctor who was managing your mom's morphine treatments. I've been reading about morphine in my nursing textbooks, and I think we need to ask him some specific questions about how the medication affects speech patterns in dying patients." My heart started racing with a mixture of hope and terror. "What kind of questions?" "Well, you said your mom's final words were unusually clear compared to how confused her speech had been for weeks," Lisa explained, pulling out her nursing textbook and flipping to a chapter about pain management. "But according to this book, morphine speech problems often get worse right before death, not better. And it says that words that sound similar, like raise and rape, are commonly confused because morphine disrupts the brain circuits that control precise pronunciation." I stared at Lisa in amazement. The possibility that Mom had tried to say, "Raise our daughter and you'll like it" advice about single parenthood rather than a horrible accusation had never occurred to me. But it made perfect sense given everything Dr. Patterson had told us about morphine's effects on speech. "We should call him today," Lisa continued firmly. "I'll make the call if you're too nervous. We need to ask him specifically about final words and whether patients can seem lucid while still having speech distortions." That afternoon, Lisa called Dr. Patterson's office from the phone in her bedroom while I listened on the extension, my hands shaking with nervousness about what we might learn. "Dr. Patterson, this is Lisa Chen," she began professionally. "I'm a nursing student and also a close friend of the Martinez family. Carmen Martinez was one of your patients who died about 6 weeks ago, and we have some questions about morphine's effects on speech that we're hoping you can help us understand." "Of course I remember Mrs. Martinez very well," Dr. Patterson replied kindly. "She was a lovely woman with a devoted family. How can I help you?" Lisa took a deep breath. "We're wondering about the speech problems that morphine causes, particularly in the final moments before death. Can patients seem to speak clearly while their words are still being distorted by the medication?" "That's an excellent question," Dr. Patterson said. "Yes, it's quite common for patients to have what appears to be a moment of clarity right before death. Their voice becomes stronger and they seem more alert, but the morphine is still affecting their speech centers. The medication doesn't wear off just because a patient seems more lucid. In fact, speech distortions often become more severe in the final hours because that's when we typically use the highest doses of morphine." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought Dr. Patterson might be able to hear it through the phone. Lisa continued asking the questions I was too nervous to voice myself. "What about words that sound similar?" Lisa asked. "Could a patient try to say one word but have it come out sounding like a completely different word?" "Absolutely," Dr. Patterson confirmed. "Morphine disrupts the precise muscle control needed for clear speech. Words that require similar tongue and lip movements often get confused. For example, a patient might try to say raise, but it comes out as race or rape because those words use very similar mouth movements. The patient's brain sends the signal for one word, but their mouth produces something that sounds quite different." I felt like I couldn't breathe. Lisa looked at me with excitement and continued the conversation. "So if a dying patient seemed to say something completely out of character, something that didn't match their personality or values, that would probably be the morphine rather than their true intention?" Lisa asked. "I would say that's very likely," Dr. Patterson replied. "In 20 years of palliative care, I've seen morphine make patients appear to say terrible things about people they love dearly. The medication can turn words of love into what sound like accusations or threats. That's why I always advise families not to take final words literally without considering the context and the patient's true character." After we hung up, Lisa and I stared at each other in amazement. Everything Dr. Patterson had said supported the theory that Mom had tried to say, "Raise our daughter and you'll like it," but the morphine had twisted it into something that sounded horrible and threatening. But I still needed more evidence before I could bring myself to believe that I had been wrong about Dad for 6 weeks. That afternoon, while Dad was at the restaurant handling the dinner rush, I went home and searched through Mom's personal belongings for the first time since she had died. In her dresser drawer underneath some old photograph albums and a jewelry box that had belonged to her mother, I found Mom's personal journal, a leather-bound book with her name embossed in gold letters on the cover. It was a gift Dad had given her for their 15th wedding anniversary, and she had been writing in it regularly for the past several years. My hands trembled as I opened the journal, terrified of what terrible secrets about our family I might discover within its pages. Most of the entries were completely ordinary and innocent notes about upcoming doctor appointments, reminders about restaurant supply orders, thoughts about books she was reading, concerns about my college expenses and my plans for the future. But then I found a series of entries about the morphine treatments that made my heart race with hope and excitement. December 1st. The morphine is helping tremendously with the bone pain, but it's causing the strangest side effects on my ability to speak clearly. Yesterday, I tried to ask Roberto to close the window because the room was getting chilly, and what came out of my mouth was, "Nose the window." We both laughed about it, but it's actually quite frightening how the medication scrambles the connection between what I'm thinking and what I'm saying. December 5th. The speech problems are getting much worse as Dr. Patterson increases my dosage to manage the increasing pain. Today, I asked Sarah to pass the salt at dinner, and what came out was, class the fault. She looked at me like I was losing my mind, which I suppose I am in some ways. Dr. Patterson says this is completely normal with high-dose morphine therapy. The drug interferes with the brain's control over speech patterns, making patients say words they never intended to say. December 10th. I'm becoming very worried about what my final words to Roberto and Sarah might sound like when the time comes. The morphine is making it almost impossible to say what I actually mean to say. Sometimes I'll try to say, "I love you," and what comes out is, "I glove you," or "I shove you." I should record a proper message while I'm still lucid and coherent, just in case my last words come out twisted and confusing. My pulse was racing as I read these entries, hardly daring to believe what they might mean for my relationship with Dad. Mom had been fully aware that morphine was twisting her words into something completely different from her intentions. She had been worried about exactly what had happened, her final message being misunderstood because of the medication's effects on her speech centers. I continued searching through her dresser drawers with growing excitement and desperation. At the very bottom of her jewelry box, tucked underneath some old earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, I found a small cassette tape in a clear plastic case. The label written in Mom's careful handwriting read, "For Roberto and Sarah. My real final words, please listen together." I stared at the cassette tape for what felt like hours, holding it in my trembling hands, as if it were a piece of evidence that could either destroy my family completely or save it from the misunderstanding that was tearing us apart. Part of me was desperate to play the tape immediately to learn the truth about Mom's real intentions, but another part of me was absolutely terrified of what I might hear. What if the recording actually confirmed my worst fears about Dad? What if Mom had made this tape specifically to document her concerns about his behavior toward me? We had an old cassette player in the living room that Mom had used to record family conversations, birthday parties, and Christmas celebrations over the years. With hands that shook so badly I could barely operate the simple controls, I inserted the tape and pressed the play button, holding my breath as I waited to hear my mother's voice for the first time since that terrible night in the hospital. Static filled the room for several seconds. Then Mom's voice emerged clearly weak and tired from her illness, but unmistakably coherent, rational, and filled with love. Hearing her speak again after 6 weeks of silence brought tears streaming down my face before she had even finished her first sentence. "My darling Roberto and my precious Sarah." She began her voice carrying all the warmth and love that had characterized our family for 19 years. If you're listening to this recording, then I'm gone. and I pray with all my heart that you found this tape quickly before any confusion or misunderstanding could damage the beautiful relationship between you two. I sank into Dad's favorite armchair, clutching the cassette player like a lifeline as Mom's voice continued with increasing strength and clarity that proved this message had been recorded during one of her good days before the morphine dosage had been increased to final levels. I know that the medication I'm taking is going to get much stronger as my condition worsens, and I'm absolutely terrified that my final words to you might come out twisted and wrong because of how morphine affects speech patterns and cognitive function. I've already experienced several frightening incidents where I tried to say one thing and something completely different and sometimes nonsensical came out of my mouth. Dr. Patterson has warned me repeatedly that this will only get worse as we increase the medication to manage my pain in the final days. I don't want either of you to be confused, hurt, or frightened by anything I might say that doesn't reflect my true feelings, my deep love for both of you, and my complete faith in the goodness of our family. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of Mom's recorded voice. She had foreseen exactly what would happen and had tried to prevent it by leaving this clear, unambiguous message for us to find after her death. Roberto, my beloved husband, and the love of my life. Mom continued, her voice growing stronger and more emotional as she addressed Dad directly. You have been the most wonderful husband and father that any woman could ever dream of having. For 24 years, you have loved me with patience, kindness, gentleness, devotion, and a strength that never wavered even during the darkest days of my illness. You have never raised your voice to me or to Sarah, never lost your temper with either of us, even when we were difficult or demanding, never made us feel unsafe or unloved or unappreciated for even a single moment. You are a good man, Roberto Martinez, one of the best men who has ever lived, and I need you to remember that truth no matter what happens in the coming days. I need you to raise our daughter with all the love, patience, wisdom, and moral guidance you have shown both of us throughout our marriage. Help her finish college and achieve her dreams of becoming a social worker. Support her as she navigates the challenges of young adulthood. Guide her as she grows into the amazing woman I know she's destined to become. And you will like the life you build together as a family of two. The word raise was crystal clear and unmistakable, spoken with careful enunciation that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or confusion. Not rape, raise. Mom had been giving Dad advice and encouragement about single parenthood, telling him that he would find joy and satisfaction in helping me navigate the challenges and opportunities of adult life. Sarah, my sweet, intelligent, beautiful daughter, and the greatest joy of my entire existence. Mom continued, turning her attention to me with the same warmth and love that had filled my childhood with security and happiness. Trust your father completely and without any reservation, doubt, or fear. He is the best man I have ever known in my entire life, and he loves you more than his own existence. Don't let grief or confusion or any misunderstanding drive a wedge between you two when you're going to need each other more than ever before. Take care of each other. Support each other through the difficult times ahead. Lean on each other for strength and comfort when the loneliness becomes overwhelming. And always remember that love is the only thing that really matters in this world. Everything else, money, career, success, social status, material possessions, is just decoration around the edges of life. Love is the foundation that everything else is built on, and you two have more love between you than most families could ever hope for. The tape continued for several more minutes with personal memories of my childhood, expressions of pride in my academic achievements, and my character development, specific advice about college and career choices, and detailed instructions about family traditions she wanted us to maintain in her memory. Every word was spoken with absolute clarity and obvious intention, leaving no doubt whatsoever about her true feelings and beliefs about our family. By the time the recording ended, I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. The relief was overwhelming and transformative, washing over me like cool water on burning skin, but it was mixed with crushing guilt and shame that threatened to drown me completely. For over 6 weeks, I had suspected my father, the kindest, most gentle, most loving man I had ever known, of being capable of sexual assault and child abuse. I had pulled away from him during the worst period of his life, when he was grieving the loss of his beloved wife and desperately needed comfort and support from his daughter. I had let morphine-twisted words poison my mind against the person who loved me more than anyone else in the world. I had interpreted his normal paternal concern as something predatory and threatening. I had avoided his touch, rejected his attempts to comfort me, and even armed myself with a weapon against the man who had never shown me anything but patience, devotion, and unconditional love. The shame of realizing how far my paranoid thinking had strayed from reality was almost unbearable. I had become exactly the kind of person I had always criticized: someone who jumped to terrible conclusions without sufficient evidence, who let fear override reason and love, who destroyed relationships based on assumptions rather than facts. But I still faced what seemed like an insurmountable problem. How could I admit to Dad what I had been thinking about him for the past 6 weeks? How could I confess that I had suspected him of harboring sexual intentions toward me? How could I explain the knife under my mattress, the way I had flinched away from his hugs, the cold and distant treatment I had given him when he was already devastated by Mom's death? Most importantly, how could I be absolutely certain that he would be able to forgive me for the pain and betrayal I had inflicted during the darkest period of his life? What if my suspicion and rejection had damaged our relationship beyond repair? What if he could never trust me again after learning what I had really been thinking about his character and his motives? That evening, when Dad returned home from managing the dinner rush at the restaurant, he looked more exhausted and emotionally defeated than I had ever seen him in my entire life. The past 6 weeks of my cold treatment and obvious avoidance had clearly taken a devastating toll on his physical and emotional well-being. He had lost at least 15 pounds, his clothes hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his eyes held a sadness and confusion that went far beyond grief over losing Mom. He moved through our house like a ghost of his former self, mechanically going through the motions of normal evening routines, but obviously struggling with depression and loneliness that he didn't know how to address or overcome. He had been taking on extra responsibilities at the restaurant to keep himself busy and distracted from his grief, staying late to do inventory and bookkeeping that could have waited, volunteering for food deliveries to shut in elderly customers just to fill the empty hours that stretched endlessly before him. I was sitting at our kitchen table with Mom's journal open in front of me and the cassette tape recorder positioned prominently beside it, finally ready to face the truth about what I had done to our relationship and accept full responsibility for the damage I had caused through my paranoid assumptions and groundless fears. "Ah, Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as he hung his coat on the hook by the back door and kicked off his work shoes. "We need to talk about Mom's final words. I know what she really meant to say. I know the truth about everything that happened at the hospital." Dad looked genuinely surprised. I hadn't initiated a real conversation with him in over 6 weeks. His weathered, tired face showed a mixture of desperate hope and extreme caution as he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, where we had shared thousands of family meals during happier times that now seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime. I found Mom's journal and a cassette tape she made before she died. I continued pushing both items toward him across the table with hands that trembled with emotion, shame, and desperate hope for forgiveness. I know that her last words were twisted by the morphine. I know she was trying to say, "Raise our daughter and you'll like it," not what it sounded like. I know that everything I've been thinking about you for the past 6 weeks has been completely horribly wrong. Dad picked up the journal with careful, reverent hands and began reading the entries I had marked with pieces of paper. I watched his face transform through a progression of emotions, confusion, giving way to understanding, then overwhelming relief, mixed with profound hurt and sadness. When he finished reading the entries about morphine's speech effects and looked up at me, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. She was giving me advice about being a single father. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion and disbelief. All this time, all these weeks of watching you pull away from me and treat me like I was some kind of dangerous stranger. It was because the morphine twisted her words of love and guidance into something that sounded horrible and threatening. Dad, I'm so incredibly sorry. I cried my own tears, falling freely as the full weight of what I had done to him crashed over me like a physical blow. I should have trusted you completely. I should have listened when you tried to explain what had happened. I should have remembered who you really are and what kind of man you've always been instead of letting fear and suspicion poison my mind against you. You thought I was capable of sexually assaulting you, Dad said quietly, stating the awful truth that neither of us had been able to speak aloud until this moment. The pain and betrayal in his voice were devastating to hear. My own daughter, who I've loved and protected and cherished more than my own life since the day she was born, believed that I might be a sexual predator who would hurt her in the most terrible way imaginable. The anguish and betrayal in his voice shattered my heart completely, making me realize for the first time the full extent of the emotional damage I had inflicted on him. I kept a knife under my mattress. I confessed the shame burning in my chest like acid. I was that terrified of you, Dad. I actually thought I might need to defend myself against my own father with a weapon. Dad's face went completely pale with shock and hurt so profound it was physically painful to witness. For a long moment, he couldn't speak at all, couldn't even seem to breathe normally. When he finally found his voice, it was barely audible. Oh, mija, my sweet, precious girl. You were lying in your bed every single night for 6 weeks, scared that I might come into your room to hurt you, feeling like you needed a knife to protect yourself from the man who used to read you bedtime stories and check under your bed for monsters. He broke down completely, then sobbing with a grief that encompassed not just the loss of Mom, but the destruction of trust between us. The realization that his own daughter had seen him as a potential rapist. The knowledge that I had been living in terror of him for weeks while he remained completely unaware of my fears and suspicions. I should have handled this situation completely differently from the beginning. Dad said through his tears, his voice broken with regret and self-recrimination. I could see how frightened and traumatized you were by your mom's death, but I was afraid that if I pushed too hard to discuss her final words, I would make your fear and confusion even worse than it already was. I kept thinking that if I gave you time and space to process your grief naturally, you would eventually be ready to talk about what had happened rationally and calmly. He continued, wiping tears from his eyes with shaking hands. I never imagined that the space I was trying to give you was actually allowing your fears to grow bigger and more paranoid with each passing day. But the silence and distance just gave me room to imagine terrible things about you. I said, beginning to understand how our mutual love and good intentions had created such a devastating and destructive misunderstanding. Every time you pulled away from me, every time you flinched when I tried to hug you goodnight, every time you avoided being alone with me in our own home, every time you locked your bedroom door, it felt like someone was driving a knife straight through my heart. Dad admitted, his voice raw with months of suppressed pain and confusion. I started to wonder if maybe there was some grain of truth to what your mom seemed to be saying about me. Maybe I had failed as a husband and father in ways that I couldn't see or understand. Maybe there really was something wrong with my character, something inappropriate or dangerous about my behavior that would justify her apparent warning about me. Maybe I was somehow a threat to you, and just didn't realize it. I could see now that Dad had been carrying his own terrible burden of self-doubt and guilt, wondering if Mom's twisted final words contained some kernel of truth about his character that he was blind to. The morphine had poisoned both of our minds, mine with paranoid fear, his with uncertainty about his own fundamental goodness and moral worth. I almost called the police to report you. I confessed the words, tumbling out in a rush of shame and regret. Last week, when you were working late at the restaurant, I actually picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency number. I was going to tell them that my dying mother had warned me that you were planning to assault me. Dad's face went even whiter, if that was possible. What stopped you? I remembered the time when I was 8 and broke my arm falling off my bike. I said, crying harder as the memory came flooding back. You carried me 6 blocks to the hospital, talking to me the whole time to keep me from panicking, and you stayed with me for 14 hours while the doctors set my bone and put on the cast. You slept in an uncomfortable chair by my bed and held my hand every time I woke up scared. I couldn't reconcile that memory with the idea that you might hurt me. And I almost had myself committed to a psychiatric hospital. Dad replied, his voice barely audible. I made an appointment with a psychiatrist because I was convinced there was something seriously wrong with my mental state that would make my own daughter afraid to be alone with me. We sat there in our kitchen, both of us crying and holding hands across the table, realizing how close we had come to destroying our family completely based on a tragic misunderstanding caused by medication that was supposed to help Mom die peacefully. Your mama would be absolutely heartbroken to know that her confused, medication-twisted final words nearly destroyed the relationship between the 2 people she loved most in the world, Dad said, squeezing my hands tightly. All she ever wanted was for us to take care of each other and support each other after she was gone. But there was still more to come. Dad released my hands and went to his bedroom, returning a few minutes later with a small notebook that I had never seen before. I need to show you something, he said, opening the notebook to reveal pages of handwritten entries. I've been keeping a journal since your mom died because I was so confused and hurt by your behavior that I started writing down my thoughts and feelings. I was afraid I might be losing my mind, and I wanted to keep track of my mental state. He showed me entries that broke my heart all over again. January 10th. Sarah pulled away from me again when I tried to hug her goodnight. I don't understand what I've done wrong. Maybe I'm not equipped to be a single father? Maybe Catherine saw something in me that I can't see myself. January 15th. I'm starting to wonder if there was some truth to Catherine's final words. Maybe I am somehow dangerous or inappropriate and don't realize it. Maybe I should see a professional about my mental health. January 20th. Made an appointment with Dr. Martinez, a psychiatrist. I need to find out if there's something seriously wrong with me that would make Sarah afraid of her own father. January 25th. Sarah avoided dinner again tonight. I can see fear in her eyes when she looks at me. If Catherine was trying to warn her about something, maybe I should remove myself from Sarah's life for her protection. I was sobbing as I read his entries, realizing that while I had been afraid he might hurt me, he had been afraid that he might actually be capable of hurting me without knowing it. The morphine had not only turned Mom's words of love into an apparent accusation, it had made both Dad and me question fundamental truths about his character that should never have been in doubt. The healing process began that very night in our kitchen, but it wasn't instantaneous or magical, like something from a fairy tale. Trust that has been shattered by months of suspicion, fear, and avoidance doesn't rebuild overnight, and both Dad and I had to work consciously and deliberately to repair the serious damage that had been done to our relationship through this devastating misunderstanding that had nearly destroyed our family. We started by listening to Mom's complete cassette recording together, sitting on our living room couch and holding hands while crying over her real final message, and grieving not just for her death, but for the precious time we had wasted on fear, suspicion, and mutual mistrust. The tape was over 30 minutes long and filled with specific memories of my childhood practical advice about managing the restaurant and my college expenses, and expressions of love that proved beyond any doubt that Mom had never suspected Dad of any inappropriate behavior toward me. Dad explained his perspective on our 2-month estrangement, helping me understand why he had been reluctant to push for immediate discussions about Mom's final words. I could see that you were absolutely terrified every time I tried to bring up the subject. He set his arm around my shoulders as we sat together for the first time since Mom's death. Your fear was so obvious and intense that I was afraid I might traumatize you even more if I forced you to talk about something you weren't emotionally ready to handle. I thought that if I gave you time to process your grief and adjust to life without your mama, you would eventually feel safe enough to ask me questions about what had happened in the hospital. Dad continued, his voice filled with regret. I never imagined that my patience and consideration were actually allowing your fears to grow stronger and more elaborate with each passing day. Instead of time healing the misunderstanding, time just made my suspicions more detailed and more paranoid. I replied, finally understanding how our mutual love and concern for each other had led us both to make decisions that ultimately made our situation worse rather than better. We established a new routine of daily honest conversations where we talked openly about our feelings, our fears, our memories of Mom, and our plans for rebuilding our relationship and moving forward as a family of 2. These discussions were sometimes difficult and emotionally painful, but they were absolutely necessary for preventing future misunderstandings and reestablishing the foundation of trust and communication that had always characterized our family before this crisis. Dad also revealed that he had been seeing Dr. Patricia Martinez, a psychiatrist, for the past 3 weeks, because he was struggling not just with grief over losing Mom, but with the growing distance between us and his fears about his own mental health. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that grief affects everyone differently and that I needed to be patient with your healing process, even though it was incredibly painful to feel like I was losing both you and your mama at the same time. He admitted. She also helped me realize that I wasn't losing my mind or becoming dangerous. I was just dealing with an impossible situation where my daughter was afraid of me for reasons I couldn't understand. Dad continued. Dr. Martinez actually suggested that we might be dealing with a medical misunderstanding related to your mom's final words, and she encouraged me to keep trying to communicate with you, even though you were rejecting my attempts. Lisa played a crucial and invaluable role in our healing process. She had never believed for a moment that Dad was capable of hurting me, and her unwavering faith in his character helped me see how far my paranoid thinking had carried me away from reality and common sense. Your mom's dying words were supposed to be about love, guidance, and encouragement for your future together as a family, Lisa said one afternoon as we walked across the UC Riverside campus together. The morphine made them sound like an accusation and a warning instead. It's not your fault that you were confused and scared, Sarah, but I'm so grateful that you found the truth before your relationship with your dad was permanently damaged. I also began seeing the college counselor, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who specialized in helping students deal with family trauma and grief-related issues. Mrs. Patterson helped me understand how shock, grief, and fear can temporarily distort even the clearest thinking, making people vulnerable to paranoid interpretations of ambiguous or confusing events. When someone we love dies after saying something that sounds threatening or accusatory, our minds naturally try to make sense of those words by creating explanations that fit with our deepest fears, Mrs. Patterson explained during one of our weekly sessions. You heard what sounded like a dying woman's warning about her husband, and your traumatized mind constructed an elaborate scenario to explain why she would say such a thing about a man you had always trusted completely. The important lesson here is that assumptions can be more dangerous than any external threat to family relationships. Mrs. Patterson continued. Learning to examine evidence rather than jumping to conclusions based on fear is a crucial skill for maintaining healthy relationships throughout your life. Over the following months, Dad and I slowly but steadily rebuilt our relationship through deliberate acts of trust, honest communication, and shared activities that reminded us why we had always been so close before this crisis nearly destroyed our family. We developed new traditions to honor Mom's memory while establishing our own identity as a two-person family unit. Weekly visits to her grave, where we would bring fresh flowers, and tell her about our monthly dinners, where we would cook her favorite recipes and share our happiest memories of her, and regular movie nights that continued our old Friday evening tradition of spending time together. Gradually, naturally, and beautifully, laughter returned to our house and our relationship. At first, we both felt guilty about experiencing joy when Mom was gone forever. But slowly we learned that happiness wasn't a betrayal of her memory or our love for her. She would have wanted us to find peace and contentment again, to build a life that honored her love for us without being paralyzed by grief and loss. 2 years later, I successfully completed my degree in social work at UC Riverside, graduating magna cum laude with honors, and immediately securing a position with the county's Child Protective Services Department. Dad was incredibly proud when I received the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence, and even more proud when I was selected for a competitive fellowship in family crisis intervention. In my application essay for the graduate program, I wrote extensively about the crucial importance of clear communication in families and how dangerous misunderstandings can destroy the most important relationships in our lives if people don't work together actively to seek truth over assumptions. My experience with family trauma and miscommunication made me particularly effective at working with cases where relationships had broken down due to poor communication, medical misunderstandings, or unfounded suspicions between family members. My first major success was with a family whose teenage daughter was convinced that her stepfather was planning to hurt her because he had made some comments during a bout with pneumonia that sounded threatening due to his fever and medication. I was able to help them understand how illness and medications can affect speech and behavior, and we successfully rebuilt their relationship through family counseling sessions. Lisa graduated from the nursing program with highest honors and immediately got a job in the oncology ward at Riverside Community Hospital, the same place where Mom had received her cancer treatments. She chose to specialize in palliative care nursing, working specifically with families of terminal patients to help them understand how medications like morphine can affect their loved ones' speech behavior and cognitive function during the final stages of illness. "I want to prevent other families from going through what you and your dad experienced," Lisa told me during one of our regular phone conversations. "Too many people don't understand that morphine and other pain medications can make dying patients say things that sound completely different from what they're actually thinking or feeling." Dad eventually began dating again, something I not only encouraged, but actively supported. He met Susan Rodriguez, a teacher at the local elementary school, who had lost her husband to a heart attack 2 years earlier. Susan was a kind, intelligent woman with grown children of her own, who understood the complexities of grief and second chances at love. She was respectful of Mom's memory while bringing her own warmth, laughter, and companionship into Dad's life. I liked her immediately and could see that she brought genuine happiness and emotional healing to Dad without trying to replace or compete with the love he had shared with Mom. But the most meaningful and emotionally powerful discovery came on the 3rd anniversary of Mom's death, when Dad and I were going through some of her personal papers and belongings that we had stored in the attic after her funeral. Hidden in a box of old correspondence that included thank you notes from restaurant customers, Christmas cards from distant relatives, and letters from my college admissions office, we found a sealed envelope addressed to both of us in Mom's handwriting, marked, "To be opened only if my final words cause confusion or pain." Inside the envelope was a letter Mom had written just 1 week before she died, apparently saving it as a final safeguard against exactly the kind of misunderstanding that had nearly destroyed our family. "My dearest Roberto and Sarah, I am writing this letter because I am increasingly worried about how the morphine is affecting my ability to communicate clearly and coherently with the people I love most in the world. Dr. Patterson has warned me repeatedly that patients on high doses of morphine often say things during their final moments that come out completely different from what they intend to express, and I am terrified that my last words to you might be misunderstood in ways that could damage your relationship with each other when you will need each other most. If my final words sound confusing, threatening, or completely unlike something I would normally say, please remember this above all else. Roberto, you are the most wonderful father Sarah could possibly have, and raising her has been your greatest joy and proudest accomplishment throughout our marriage. Continue to raise her with love, patience, wisdom, and moral guidance, just as you have always done, and you will like the amazing, accomplished, compassionate woman she is destined to become under your loving care. Sarah. My precious daughter, trust your father completely and without reservation. He is not only the best man I have ever known, but one of the best men who has ever lived. No medication, no matter how powerful or confusing, can change the fundamental truth of my love and respect for both of you. You are both good people, the best people I have ever known, and nothing that might come out of my mouth during my final moments can alter that reality. It was as if Mom had somehow foreseen exactly what would happen and had tried to prevent our family's destruction with this letter. The word raise appeared multiple times in the letter, providing absolute confirmation that this was what she had meant to say during those final moments in the hospital, when morphine had twisted her words of love into something that sounded like a horrible accusation. Today, 5 years after that terrible night when morphine transformed Mom's loving guidance into what seemed like a dying woman's warning about her husband, I work as a licensed family therapist in Riverside, specializing in medical trauma and communication disorders that affect family relationships. My personal experience with misunderstanding and near family destruction has made me uniquely qualified to help other families navigate similar crises and rebuild relationships that have been damaged by medical complications, medication side effects, or simple miscommunication during stressful times. My most significant professional achievement involved a family whose elderly grandfather with dementia had accused his adult son of financial abuse, accusations that were tearing the extended family apart, even though they weren't true. The grandfather's dementia was causing false memories and paranoid thinking, just as morphine had twisted Mom's final words into something she never intended to say. I was able to help the family understand how brain diseases can create false accusations and distorted perceptions, and we successfully rebuilt their relationships through education counseling and a commitment to seeking truth rather than reacting to assumptions. Dad continues managing our family restaurant, but he has also become something of a local expert on family crisis intervention and medical communication issues. He volunteers regularly at Riverside Community Hospital, talking to families about how medications can affect dying patients' speech and behavior, and sharing our story to help other people understand that confused final words don't necessarily reflect a person's true thoughts, feelings, or intentions. Carmen wanted to tell me to raise our daughter with love and patience, and that message has guided every single decision I've made about Sarah's future. He tells the families he counsels. The morphine made her words come out wrong, but her real intention preserved in her journal, her cassette recording, and her final letter has been the foundation of everything we've accomplished together as a family. Susan and Dad married last year in a beautiful ceremony at St. Teresa Catholic Church, with me proudly serving as maid of honor and giving a speech about second chances, the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, and the importance of never giving up on family relationships. Susan has become not a replacement for Mom, but a wonderful addition to our family who brings her own gifts of wisdom, humor, and unconditional love to our lives, while honoring and respecting the memory of Mom's enduring influence on our family values. The experience taught us lessons about communication, trust, and forgiveness that continue to shape how we approach every relationship in our lives. We learned that trauma and grief can temporarily distort even the clearest thinking, that fear feeds on silence and grows stronger in isolation, and that assumptions can be more destructive than any external threat to family unity and love. Most importantly, we discovered that healing is always possible when people are willing to fight for each other and choose truth over comfortable but dangerous assumptions. Love requires constant work, honest communication, and the courage to address difficult subjects directly, rather than hoping they will resolve themselves through time and avoidance. Mom's real final message to raise our daughter with love continues to be the guiding principle of everything Dad and I accomplish together. Every milestone I reach, every challenge I overcome, every success I achieve in my career helping other families is built on the foundation of his patient guidance and unwavering support, exactly as Mom had envisioned during those final weeks of her life when she worried about leaving us to face the future without her wisdom and love. Her memory and her wisdom continue to strengthen our bond every single day, proving that genuine love truly is stronger than fear, that truth will always overcome misunderstanding when people are committed to seeking it, and that families willing to fight for each other can survive and thrive despite even the most devastating challenges that life can present to test their unity and devotion.